that we have a little Q&A icon down the bottom that you can actually click on at any stage during the conversation and put your question up, where I'll try and throw it into the conversation with Taylor where possible. And before I begin, also, thank you so much to Jane Seaton for organising this event. It's just such a privilege to be able to talk to authors from all around the world in this time when we're so isolated from each other. Welcome, Taylor Jenkins Reid.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me.
It's so exciting. I've been looking forward to this so much. I have to tell you, one thing, I'm a very slow reader and I managed to get through this book in a day.
Oh,
Absolutely.
wow. Okay.
Which surprised me as much as anybody, because it was just one of those books where you just dive in and you just you're not going out for the rest of the day because you're just in the story.
Thank you.
I'm also going to fess up, and the only reason I'm going to fess up to this is because I've heard other interviewers do it too, is that I also went looking for this great band of the late 70s that I'd clearly missed, because the story is so utterly believable.
I really appreciate that. I never set out to do that. I'm not trying to trick anyone, but it is so nice when, because I worked so hard to try and make it feel authentic and real and to be an immersive experience. And so it's just really nice when I find out that it was immersive. And it's
so much so. They were all just face palming, just going, how could I have fallen into that ruse so completely? Hey, so Daisy Jones and the Six has been out in the world for over a year now, and it is a kind of a privileged position for me to be able to ask you about how that has impacted your life, having this book out in the world, because usually
Sure.
I'm talking to authors when they've just released their work.
Right, and it's just come out. Yeah. It's been lovely. I mean, look, it's this is my 6th book, and so I know I've been down this road publishing a book. I know that not every book gets the amount of attention that this book has gotten. You know, not every book gets Reese Witherspoon to blurb it and make it into a TV show. And I feel incredibly fortunate that this book has gotten that attention. And it's been really nice to get to share my work with more readers, which is what this book has brought me. And it's nice because also people tend to be reading this one, and then some people go back to my backlist and they read The Seven Husbands of Evelyn Hugo or ones that came before that. And so it's just been a really, really lovely experience.
I would love for people who have joined us today who haven't yet read the book, for you to introduce us to Daisy Jones and to the Six.
Great. Yeah. So it's funny. There's Daisy Jones and there's the Six, and then there's the book Daisy Jones and the Six. Daisy Jones and the Six, the book, is about the rise and fall of the 70s rock band. But in particular, it's the story of Daisy Jones, who is this woman who was born in the Hollywood Hills, right up on, behind the Sunset Strip, who finds her way into the rock scene of the late 60s and early 70s. And at first is kind of a groupie, but she feels like she has something to say, and she wants to write her own music, and she wants to be a performer in her own right. And so she begins this pop career. And at the same time that that's happening, you have this band called the Six, and they're coming out of Pennsylvania, sort of kind of like working class heroes kind of thing, like a Bruce Springsteen vibe if he was a whole band. And they are led by their lead singer, Billy Dunn, who is this sort of brooding, tortured, very handsome lead singer. And the Six gets out to LA and they get a record deal, and their first album does okay. And then on the second album, the producer's like, well, why don't we bring in, we need a hit single. We really want you guys to break out. Why don't we bring in this pop singer, Daisy Jones? And so Daisy comes into the studio and sings on one of Billy's songs that he's written for his wife, Camila. And she messes with the lyrics and thinks she knows better than him what his song's about, and they produce this incredible, intoxicating duet, which is called Honeycomb. And from there, Billy can't get rid of Daisy if he wants to, because that is where his success comes from. So you have these two people, Billy and Daisy, who don't really get along and are maybe too similar and shouldn't be in the same room together, but they have to be in order to do their best work. And so that's how you have this very volatile band becoming one of the biggest bands in the world, but it is unfortunately not sustainable. And so this is the story of how.
Mm. Now, we're sort of led to believe that it's based on the volatile relationship between Stevie Nicks and Lindsey Buckingham in
Sure.
Fleetwood Mac, but
yeah.
there's actually more. You've thrown a lot more into that mix, haven't you?
Yeah, I mean, look, my love of Fleetwood Mac and my love of the tension between Stevie and Lindsey, it was absolutely a reason why I got excited about writing a story like this. And I did a lot of research on Fleetwood Mac. And I did that research for two reasons. One, I wanted to really get to know their story and be inspired by it. But I also wanted to make sure I didn't steal their story, that this isn't a story about Fleetwood Mac. And you have to know the story of Fleetwood Mac in order to not write the story of Fleetwood Mac. And so they maybe feel like Fleetwood Mac, but they're not. And almost everything that happens to Daisy Jones and the Six, whether it's actual things that are happening or the sort of iconic place that they hold in culture, or like Daisy's fashion or Billy's vibe, none of that is Fleetwood Mac. In fact, I stole a lot from other artists instead, like Linda Ronstadt, Debbie Harry, Patti Smith, Joni Mitchell, Crosby, Stills and Nash. Bruce Springsteen, as I'd mentioned, was a huge inspiration for a lot of the book. Tom Petty, Jackson Browne. I read about all of these people. The Beatles and Rolling Stones too are like the Beatles were obviously like a very volatile group, and the relationship between the two lead singers is what led to their downfall as well. And so I tried to take from all these different places, and in taking from all of them and adding my own flair to it, hopefully Daisy Jones and the Six feels like believable and real, but entirely new.
Mm. And it is a fascinating concept that, you know, to fans, it can appear that there's this incredible creative synergy, and then suddenly out of nowhere, a band that they adore is making music that they want to have in their collection is gone.
Yeah. I mean, that was a huge inspiration for me for writing the book, because I've had bands that I really loved that broke up out of nowhere, and you feel like when you're listening to their music, you feel like connected to them and you understand them and they understand you. And when something happens like that, when they break up out of the blue, you think, wait, how did I not see it? What was I missing? You know, I feel so connected to these people. I felt that way about a band called the Civil Wars, who broke up in 2013. They're a country, kind of like a country western folk. I don't know. They defy categorization, which is part of what I loved about them. And I just felt like their music was so interesting and intense, and I connected with it so much. And then they broke up out of nowhere. And I spent a lot of time trying to figure out why they broke up, and like Googling it and trying to read interviews and like trying to piece it together. And I just found nothing. And that was a big part of this book, was like, you want to know. I felt a connection to these people, and so I want to know the truth of it. And it's funny because in the writing of the book, as I started to create these characters and get to know these characters and put myself in the mindset of them, you sort of start to realize like none of us are owed these answers. Like we feel a connection to these people, but it's a one-sided connection. They're writing about themselves and their life, and we feel a connection to them. But in fact, they don't know us, and they don't owe us any information about their lives. You know, like part of the difficulty of you know, what broke up the Beatles, and the fact that there's 1,000 different answers to that, is that John Lennon and Paul McCartney and Ringo and George, like, they're human beings. And the truth is that sometimes people just get sick of each other over a period of time. And having a creative relationship is a very intense thing that most of the most, you know, prolific and brightest burning ones don't really last that long. So the answers are never as like juicy as we think. It's not like, oh, Yoko Ono broke up the Beatles. It's like, no, people grow apart. Someone wants to do one thing, someone else wants to do another. And we're not really owed any of those answers, which is why I think the book is fun, because within the world of the book, you are owed those answers and you will get those answers.
Yeah. I was interested in the acknowledgements that you thank your agent, Teresa Park, for her enthusiasm for the concept in its very early stages. And I'd love to hear that story about the very early germination of this.
Yeah. Well, you know, it's funny. My agent, part of what I love about her so much and what I trust about her so much is that she does not mince words. And so she will tell me if she thinks something is great, and she will tell me if she thinks that it's awful. And I've been on both sides of that coin. And when I finished the book that I wrote before Daisy Jones, The Seven Husbands of Evelyn Hugo, I finished it. I finished the edits on it, and I think it was like 4 days later, I gave birth to my daughter, and I became a mom. And so I had scheduled to take about 3 months of maternity leave where I wasn't going to write anything. And that was the first time that I had ever, since I began writing, was the first time I'd ever said, I'm not writing right now. So it'll probably been a solid like 8 years of just like writing regularly. And then I took these 3 months off, and I really didn't think anything. Like I was so in the world of like, how many ounces of breast milk has she had? Like that was like where I was. And then it got to be toward the end of the 3 months, and I was like, okay, like it's time to come up with an idea. And once I started thinking, there were 2 ideas that came to me. And one was this epistolary novel idea about 2 people whose spouses were having an affair. And the other was this wild idea of like, what if I wrote about a band? And so I set a phone call with her, and I say, okay, I'm going to pitch you these 2 ideas. And I pitched the first one about the band, and I go, so it's like, I don't know if you know this band, the Civil Wars, but they broke up suddenly, and I was like really obsessed with it. And so I was thinking I would do a fictional oral history about a fake 70s rock band. And she interrupted me, she stopped me, and she was like, you have to do that. You have to write that book. That is phenomenal. You have to write that book. She didn't even listen to the second idea. And she was so, I mean, as I said, like I have so much trust in her because I know she will tell me the truth. And she was so passionate about it that she didn't even need to hear the rest of the pitch. She was sold. And it was like, I got off the phone with her, and it was that moment where you're like, of course, that's what I meant to, you know, it's like you sort of look back, and what is it, hindsight bias, you know, where it's like, well, obviously that's the greatest idea ever, you know. But I just got so excited about it because she was so excited about it. And that got me through to, you know, actually putting the story together. And then I just fell in love with it.
Had you ever been so sure about a book idea before?
Yes. Well, but here's the thing is like, there's a huge difference between being sure about a book idea, like this is how I want to spend my time, and being sure about a book idea, like this is going to be a good book. And I have never been sure about a book idea like it was going to be a good book. With The Seven Husbands of Evelyn Hugo, that was a story that like I had formed over time. It had called to me. No one was going to convince me to write anything other than that book. That was the book I had to write at that time. And I remember even like standing up in front of, you know, a lot of times like before a book comes out, you'll meet with booksellers and try to get them excited about your book and tell them about your book. And I went to this conference, and they were like, you know, soft pitch your book to us. I remember saying, like, I pitched something about the book, and then I remember saying, which, like, why did I say this? But I was like, and truly, I love this book so much, and I believe in this book so much that I am okay if nobody likes it. I like it, and that is enough for me. That is how much I love this book. And then afterwards, I was like, that's not how you sell a book to somebody. But so I was very confident, like, that's what I wanted. And with Daisy Jones, it was what I wanted to write. But it was maybe a month before I turned in the book to my agent. And I had worked on it really intensely for a long time. And I read it where I like thought it was done. And so I read it and I was like, I don't think there's something missing. There's something not right. And I had become so obsessed with Fleetwood Mac by that point, like in all my research, that I said to my husband, I like feel like I'll remember this moment forever, but I walked out into the living room and I said to my husband, what if the Seven Husbands of Evelyn Hugo is my rumors and Daisy Jones is Tusk? And I was like panic stricken. And I remember Alex, my husband, was like, it's going to be okay. Like, it's going to be okay. Like, I'm sure your book is good. And then I remember telling my brother the same thing. And my brother is like a real music aficionado, and he helped me with a lot of the references. And I told my brother the same thing. And he goes, well, actually, most music critics would tell you that Tusk is a superior album. I was like, you're right. You know, it just didn't sell as well and isn't as popular. But even honestly, up until the minute I sent the book in, I was convinced my career was over and it was a terrible book.
Wow.
You can never see it clearly until afterwards.
Yeah. You mentioned already that it's written like you're reading an article in the Rolling Stone, basically,
right?
Which is brilliant. And part of what kind of drew me into believing that it was real was because of that format and the way. As a person who interviews people and transcribes things, I was looking at it going, bloody hell, this was so much work. Like, how much work did she put into transcribing these interviews? Was it always in that format?
Yeah. To me, it was part of the genesis of the story. I don't think I could have told it any other way. I don't think, it wasn't like, I want to tell a story about 70s rock, and then I thought, well, maybe I can do it as an oral history. It was, I'm going to write a fake oral history, and it's going to be about 70s rock. Because part of what's fun about writing about fake famous people, this is my second book that's done that, is that you want the reader to feel like they're getting a look behind the curtain. That's what's fun about an actual oral history is, oh, here's what was going on back then. Here's the behind the scenes dirt. You know, you want that voyeuristic sense that you're being let in on a secret finally. You're in this secret club of what actually happened. And that piece felt very, very important. It has to be that in order to tell this story in the way that I wanted to tell it. So the question wasn't, should I write it as an oral history? The question was, can I pull it off? Like, can you actually write fiction as an oral history? Because oral histories in our culture are typically a nonfiction format, and they're predicated upon a shared experience. They're predicated upon, oh, we all know this episode of television, and now you're going to see behind the scenes. Like, we all know this band, and now we're going to find out. So in order to do it as an oral history, it has to do two things. It has to set up the legend in a way where you don't notice that you're being incepted with the idea that there's a legend to know about, and then reveal the truth behind it. Yeah. And I just remember, like, the first, like, it was my sixth book. So, like, I've stood in front of a lot of blank pages, you know, but I was looking at that page and I had talked it up to my agent and I talked this big game to everybody, I'm going to write this book. And it was the first time in a long time I looked at that blank page and I was like, wait, what do I write? Like, how am I supposed to pull this off? Like, I'm supposed to start talking about a band as if they existed when they never existed and the reader's never heard of them. Like, how do I do that? But, you know, you just put one foot in front of the other and write and rewrite, and eventually you get there.
Yeah. I was curious on that to know whether you began writing at the beginning of the book as it currently is.
I would love to not write chronologically, but I just can't. I have to write the book as you see it. But what I did do is I did a lot of work on who the band was within culture, kind of in a notebook, before I started writing about them. So I knew, here are each of the band members, here's what they play, here's some songs that they may have written back in the day. You know, I tried to put them in the context of the real 70s rock scene in order to understand the world, the place in the world that they would occupy. And I had started it by writing a page that's no longer in the book. We ended up cutting it because it was redundant, but it was the only way that I could start, which was essentially writing like a paragraph about who the band was. And so I had that paragraph, and then I went into the story. And then fortunately I worked on it enough times and got all of that information into the body of the work, so that by the time my editor got it, she was like, oh, you've actually shown all of this already. You don't need it, you know, which felt like, oh, wow, like I did it. You know, it's in the text.
Yeah. You were talking about some of the research that you've done and kind of contextualizing this band for yourself before you could even start writing it. And I was really interested in because you talked about your brother being super helpful, because you don't have a musical background personally, do you?
None.
You had to do the deep dive.
I knew nothing. I did not listen to 70s rock. I was like a Fleetwood Mac greatest hits fan. I truly knew nothing. But I knew I'm very good at it, and by this point I've become practiced enough in it that if I am curious about something, I will follow that thread really far and get really into the weeds on something and know what details I need and what I don't. And it's funny because my first 4 books were all contemporary, set in Los Angeles, not in any particular, they didn't really require much research. My next set of books has required a lot of research, and I've come to really value and feel like excited about the fact that I can pick any topic in the world that I want and then just study it enough to fake it for a book. And it's funny because it really is like I am faking it for the book, because there are times now where like I'll get into a conversation with someone and they'll be like, yeah, we know this band so and so, and I'm like, no, if it's not in the book, I don't know it. Like I don't have a comprehensive knowledge of this. I have like pockets of very, very deep knowledge in the areas that I needed in order to pull this off. But I'm not an aficionado necessarily. It's like knowing where to look for the information and knowing what information to look for, and then trying to just step into the world and color it as best you can.
But you did some really authentic work in there too. I was flicking through again last night just to see bits and pieces in the book, and there's this bit where Karen is talking about how Karen, for people who haven't read the book, is the keyboardist in the Six, and she's talking about how they bring the song, was it Honeycomb, that they bring back into the studio? And she's talking about how she, like, that Billy had wanted it to be kind of pared back, but she had a lot of fun putting fifths in, and I was going, Taylor, you know this stuff.
I know exactly the part that you're talking about, because sustained roots and fifths is what she says. I don't even know what that means. I just know that at one point I did know, and I used it properly. And now it's just, you just have to know where to go to find the information and like what information to use. Because the other thing too is like when you're just starting out, you'll write down anything. It's like, oh, this is called this and this is called that. And you want to use it all because you've learned all of this new stuff and you want to show everybody what you've learned. And then your draft just ends up looking like you're just bragging about all the terms that you heard. So you have to take them all out. And it becomes the skill of saying this phrase or this detail creates a visceral reaction in both someone who doesn't know about this world and somebody who does. It's like picking those moments and hitting just the right detail that makes it come to life. And because most of the time in this process, I start out as a novice and I end up for a very brief period of time as someone who actually knows quite a bit about it, I can bridge those worlds. I think if I was someone who was so lost in that world and had been my whole life, I wouldn't be able to tell you how to explain it to someone who didn't know anything about it. But you don't have to know anything about rock in order to enjoy this book. because I knew nothing about rock when I started it. And that's really the fun part of writing these books lately for me, is like, what world can I go into and get lost in? It is this unforeseen, incredible gift of my career lately that I get to do that, because I see those changes for the rest of my life. Like, my kid is 4 years old and she loves Linda Ronstadt, like loves her. And that's because of Daisy Jones, because I was listening to it while writing it, and because I was exposed to it then, I'm more likely to listen to it now. And you just see the way your life changes because of these roads you go down.
Is enriched.
Mm-hmm.
I spent a lot of time thinking about, because I used to be an avid reader of the Rolling Stone, and at some stage in Daisy Jones and the Six, there's a Rolling Stone journo who's embedded with the band.
Yeah.
And it really made me think about the change in the relationship between music journo and band from then to now, and also the incredible power that a music journo at that time had to drive the narrative of a band.
Yeah. Well, part of what's nice about writing about something like the 70s or the 60s or even the 80s is you are able to go back to the time when there was a very succinct structure for how artists could talk to their fans. So, you know, it's like when we're talking about music, your access to a band that you loved, if you were a fan, was by going to their concert and hoping to sneak backstage, by reading an interview with them and gleaning some piece of information that you hadn't heard before, trying to read between the lines of what they were saying or revealing, or like maybe sending them fan mail and getting a generic letter back. And so because everything's a lot more controlled, everything takes on a lot more importance. The Rolling Stone interview is not just an opportunity for you to tell the world that you have an album coming out. It's also how your only opportunity to reflect, you know, who you are as a person, what you think about music, what you think about your music. You know, it all takes on a lot more importance. Now, every celebrity has the ability to talk directly to their fans at any given time. And there's a lot of really positive things about that. And there's a lot of democratization, and we're listening to people more, and all that's great. There's a loss of romanticism of, you know, like the great celebrity profile or the great celebrity interview in which you get to see a glimpse of someone whose art you admire. You get a little bit closer to them, but you can't quite touch them. You know, that just doesn't exist in the same way. So that's what's fun about going back in time when things worked in a way that was much more simple and controlled, is things took on more importance.
Yeah, it's and also the fact that they were literally on display to that journalist. Like constantly, there was no escape from that at all. Right. So every little subtlety of the, you know, where the niggles were in those relationships was on display. And
I think too, like, you know, you had rock critics around and they, you know, knew how to speak your language and they were of your world, and it's much easier to let your guard down. Now, you know, we live in a world where everyone, not even celebrities, but almost everyone, has to be somewhat aware of the camera in their lives, that you know, your guard is up more. Things that you say, certainly as a celebrity, you have to think twice about them because everybody can see you. And I think it's positive in so many ways. And it's also, there's a loss there too. Like with everything you gain, there's always a loss. Celebrities are more guarded and more sophisticated about media manipulation now than they were before. And so you're dealing with people who are much more slick and able to navigate the conversation more like a politician, as opposed to back in the 70s when it was like, you know, oh, whatever, man, I'm just drinking a beer and talking to this person who I'm convinced is my buddy, and then I'm surprised when the article comes out and, you know, they actually were being much more observant and saw more than I wanted them to see. But in that scenario, the reader wins, because you get to see more of the dirt and the edge than I think we see now.
Yeah. You talked about writing about this is your second book about fake famous person, and I've also read Evelyn Hugo, and it's brilliant.
Thank you.
It's an interesting thing that you step into, because you kind of, as you say, you've got to really understand the context of that person's environment, but then completely fabricate their world. And I think I'm interested in talking to you about, because you've chosen strong women for both of those characters, and women who actually were really taking a stand against some quite important issues of their time as well. And I'd love to talk to you about that in the context of Daisy, first of all, but then perhaps with Evelyn, because I think possibly she even more so was really taking a stance.
It's funny, because everything that you're saying is true, and some of it I'm doing on purpose, and some of it I'm doing just because I don't know any other way to be. And so it's interesting, because when you do write, you know, more than one book, people are able to then see within your work the things that you're doing maybe unintentionally, and then you get this reflected back to you. And it's been very interesting to see, because I don't think of Evelyn and Daisy as women who are or strong women standing up against something. Like, I don't think of it that way, but in fact, you're completely right, and they are. I just don't know any other, like, if they weren't, why would I write about them, is like the thought in my head. So I'm not even realizing what I'm doing. But with Daisy, you know, when I wrote Evelyn Hugo, I felt like there was a moment where I was like, oh, I don't think I'll ever write a book again, because I put everything I've thought about the world into Evelyn Hugo. And there are so many issues that are covered, and so many things that Evelyn goes through that were my opportunity to talk about things that I care about. And when I got to the end of that book, it was the first time where I thought, okay, I've left it all out on the dance floor. Like, there's nothing left. And it wasn't until I had a kid that I started to see there was still so much more in the world that I hadn't experienced and that I wanted to talk about. And one of the things I started to go back to was Evelyn was one type of famous woman, but the world is filled with all sorts of different types of famous women that are navigating this world the best they can, women that we put up on a pedestal for one reason or another, and then try to knock off, because that's what we do as human beings. And I kept coming back to this thing that had happened to me when I was in my early 20s. And it happens to Daisy Jones at the really very early on in the book, and is a sort of seminal moment for her character, which I didn't know it was going to be until I found myself writing it. But I'll tell you the story, and then if those who have read the book will know where I'm going with this. But it was like kind of a date, and we were at this bar called Barney's Beanery, which is a place that Daisy goes in the book. And I don't really like drinking alcohol. Like, I don't like the taste of alcohol, but I was on a date. And so I ordered a cocktail that was like a pretty mild cocktail. And then I was like, but I know I'm not going to like that. So can I also have a Diet Coke? And I was like, I've got my Diet Coke as a chaser for my cocktail, which was like a cute, whatever, a clever thing to say. And the guy that I was on this date with pulled out a notebook from his back pocket and wrote it down and was like, that's great, I'm going to use that one day. And because he was a writer. And I was so furious that this man thought that not only was my idea his for the taking, but also that clearly his career was going to offer him an opportunity to use it before I could ever use that. And it was like one of those things that happens, and then you kind of just put it away, and you're like, yep, just like one more thing's happened to me, whatever. And then I thought, if it happens to Daisy Jones, then it offers an opportunity to talk about the fact that so often, and definitely in rock during that period of time, men think of women as something to exploit. That we're not artists in our own right. We're there to support their artistic vision. We are, the backdrop to their genius, and the things that we say can inspire them in the way we live our life. We can be their muse, but they are in fact the artist. And so Daisy is at Barney's Beanery, and she is not like me, and she actually does quite a bit of drugs and drinks a lot. So I couldn't make it that she was having a chaser for a cocktail, because no one's going to believe that. So I had it that what she does is she orders what she calls an up and down, because she's trying to stabilize herself on the drugs that she's taking. So she has champagne to bring her up, and then she has coffee to bring her up, and then champagne to bring her down. So she calls it an up and down. And the guy that she's with is like, oh, I'm going to use that one day. And then she talks about how she's not somebody's muse. She is the somebody. Yeah. And I wrote that at the beginning of the book, and that became, okay, this is who Daisy Jones is this woman who everyone's trying to take something from, and she's just trying to keep something of herself for herself. And that, and she's got some other issues in there that she's dealing with over the course of the book too, but that became a real driving force for her.
I was just thinking that you actually put that quite into the very first chapter, didn't you?
Yeah.
At the very end of the first chapter, she says, I had absolutely no interest in being somebody else's muse. I'm not a muse. I am the somebody. End of fucking story.
Yeah. She
so
puts it in
the ground rule was laid. Yeah. And what's also interesting in this context, I was going to say, is that you could easily have written a book about the world of 70s rock from a very male perspective.
Oh yeah. I mean, it can easily be done. I couldn't easily do it. I write about women. It's not that I don't also write about men, and Daisy Jones and the Six is the first time that I really dug in and gave a full 3-dimensional point of view to men in my stories, because normally they're first person, and the first person perspective is the woman, and so the men are naturally at least one step removed from the reader. This was the first time this is also about men, and I love writing about men, and I'll continue to do that, but I am here to write about women. I'm here to write about the inner lives of women. I find it important, I find it interesting, and I find it sort of thrilling and daring to write about the truth as I see it of what it means to be a woman, because we've had that story filtered through men for most of human history, and we're just now starting to see that filtered through women. And I just think it's the most inspiring thing and the most interesting thing to write about. It's funny, it's like I've spent a lot of time writing about the inner lives of women, and only now am I like, okay, I'll include men too, I guess. But women for me that's where it's at. That's where my heart lies, is telling women's stories.
So was it a revelation for you then to inhabit the male characters in the way that you needed to for this book?
It really wasn't. It was very easy. And I've said before, like, when we're talking about, like, there are a lot of characters in this book, and there are a lot of different types of women in this book. And look, like, there's a part of me that relates to Daisy. Obviously, I gave her something that had happened to me. There's a lot of me that relates to Karen. There's a lot of me that relates to Camila. There's a lot of me that relates to Simone, who are these very strong, 4 strong women in this book. I relate the most probably to Billy, to, this person who is a solo creative force, who is in full control of their vision, who struggles when trying to accommodate somebody else's vision. Like, my husband and I write together sometimes, and he's very gracious and kind, because I will be like, no, why would we do that? That's a dumb idea. Don't say that. Like, I'm very controlling, and I have to learn to be like, oh, you know what? Like, when it comes to art, other people can be right too. Like, I need to learn that, and I'm still learning it. There are a lot of things about Billy that I feel, especially, Billy is becoming a father and learning what he's willing to give up for his children throughout the course of this novel. And, my daughter was 3 months old when I started it, and she was a year old when I finished it. That feeling of becoming a parent, and what does it mean, and how does it change you? That was all things that I gave to Billy. I love writing about men. I don't find it particularly challenging. I do find it exciting because it offers an opportunity to think in a different way. I think, honestly, a lot of what I aim to do is sort of genderless, but in our society, if something's not male, then it is female.
Yeah.
And so I've just sort of embraced that. There was a period of time where I felt very strongly that the situation should be, I write for everybody. And it's like, well, you know what? Women are the ones who read my books, and women are the people that show up, and women are the ones that want to read about other women. And I love women, and I am here for women. And if men read my books, which they've started to, that's lovely and novel to me. Like, oh, interesting. But women are who I write for.
Mm. I love the incredible tension that you create through this book by having, it's not just a direct relationship between Billy and Daisy, because Billy is married to Camilla and it has a profoundly deep and loving relationship with her. But as we haven't talked about the drugs and alcohol being in the mix yet, but that's, creates a lot of, I guess, diminished willpower and all sorts of other things that, so was it always your idea that Billy would be married, or did you feel then that you had to create tension by doing that?
No, I think what it is I think it's really interesting to read a story about people that can't be together. Just can't be together. There are reasons why they can't, and I wanted to play with the idea of maybe they shouldn't be together. And it was very important to me too, from the beginning, that this not be a love triangle. This isn't like, ooh, what sort of complicated relationship do Billy and Daisy have? And is that going to supersede the relationship that he has with his wife? Or is he going to leave his wife for Daisy? Or those questions are really great for other stories. And I've actually used them in other stories before, but that wasn't this story, because to me, the two are not in opposition. Daisy is not in opposition to Camilla. Daisy and Camilla are two different ways of being a woman. And they both speak to Billy, who has different sides of who he is, and he's wrestling with two different sides of himself. And it doesn't have to be that these two women are fighting over him. Life unfolds, I would say, more often than not in these areas of gray in which it's sort of unclear, what somebody should do. And all you can do is just sort of do what you do, make the decision that you make and stand by it. So I was interested in that complexity.
I found Daisy, I know she's interestingly strong and vulnerable at the same time. And I scribbled down at one point that I found her, she's kind of inscrutable in a certain way. Well,
part of what's interesting about Daisy is I love her, and I wrote her, and I feel very loyal to her, which is all to say that I'm now going to criticize her, which is that I trust her take on things that happened 20 years ago less than I trust other people, because she was so broken during that period of time that, well, and I should say, I don't trust Billy's take either, but like, I think there's a way of reading the book and saying, oh, you know what? Like, Karen's probably always telling the truth, as close to the truth as she can get, I don't think there's not one answer to that question. You can read the book 1,000 different ways. But to me, Billy and Daisy kind of can't be trusted about the things that happened. They're so self-serving and so self-obsessed in the way that rock stars can be, that I think what's tough about Daisy is when she says, you know, this is why I did what I did, does she know why she did what she did? Or is she now just coming up with a reason that makes sense because in general she's impulsive and she doesn't know you know?
Yeah.
So there's more to read between the lines with her and with Billy than the rest of the characters, I think.
That's such an interesting relationship to have with a character.
Yeah. Well, part of what's so fun about it is you actually have the relationship because there's two Daisies, right? There's the Daisy in the 70s that we're hearing about, but we're hearing about her filtered through the Daisy of, you know, who's almost, you know, 65 years old, telling you a story about them. And so we're never directly seeing Daisy Jones at the age of 25. We're directly seeing Daisy Jones at the age of 68, telling us what she did and why she did it when she was 25. And so there are many layers to the story. It's not just what's happening in the 70s. It's what has happened since then and how does that color the story that they're telling themselves about their lives, because we're always retelling our story to ourselves, right? Like, in order for me to make sense of today, I'm going to tell you the story of my life that makes sense, that all leads up to this moment. But this moment's always changing. So my story about my life is always changing. And I'm finding, you know, and you have to find these narrative arcs that don't exist in real life, but we do it to ourselves. And Daisy and Billy, I mean, everybody in the book, they're doing that. They're telling you the story that fits into their narrative of, you know, and I think you see that like with Billy and Eddie, for instance, like Eddie's the bassist and Billy's the lead singer. And Eddie just has this chip on his shoulder, like he should have been Billy, you know, and Billy never respected him. And everything that they're telling you about that tension is self-serving to get to who they think the hero of the story is, which is themselves. But there is no actual hero of the story. There's just people behaving, you know, the way that they behave and then trying to come up with a reason for it. Which was just a really fun part of writing this book, is like thinking that many steps into it.
And I mean, you talked about part of the reason why Billy and Daisy were the least trustworthy in the sense that they were more broken at the time, but also like the bit we haven't really talked about is the drugs and alcohol, which is just next level and but kind of pretty normal for the rock scene at that time as well.
Right.
But well, it's pretty interesting because you're not a person who does drugs and alcohol. So
can I tell you, I had to like ask my brother like what drugs people would be doing, or like I did this whole thing where I was trying to come up with like, okay, well, what drugs would people do in the 70s and like how would that affect you and like what's it like I even had a thing with somebody who I don't remember who I asked at this point, but I was like, does coke smell like something? Like I've never smelled it or like actually been near it, so like does it have a smell? And they described to me the smell of coke and I was like, okay, cool. Like wrote it into the book. And I was on like message boards where people were reminiscing about like drugs they did in the 70s and like how they referred to them, and I'd be writing down like, you know, okay, you would refer, these are called, you know, Dexedrine, call them Dexies, you know, and it's like that whole thing. But it just felt really dishonest to try and tell the story and pretend like none of the people in it were doing drugs. And it also felt really boring to tell the story and to have it be exclusively about drugs, which is what so many rock stories are about. You know, you hit that, like those beats of every rock biopic where it's like, you know, he's coming up and everybody thinks he's the next big thing. And then he starts to get a little, you know, his head grows too big and he's not coming home to his wife and he's drinking too much and he's doing too many drugs, then he hits rock bottom and everyone forgives him and he, you know, it's like we've seen that. So I was like, what if we just do that, but we truncate, we make it as quick as possible. So by the time the story really gets started, Billy's already done that. Billy's already a guy who's now sober and trying to keep it together, and he's had all of his mistakes in his past and he's on his 9th life. And he needs to get it right. That just felt more interesting to me.
Yeah. I have a question from from Helen, who's joined the conversation, and she was interested to know a little bit more. You mentioned at the very beginning about how the rights for Daisy Jones and the Six were sold well, they were sold pretty much
Yeah.
before the book was published. Helen's interested to know the story of how you came to sell the TV rights and whether you're involved with the screen adaptation.
Oh, yeah. So I'm technically a producer on it, but they're just being very nice to me. I'm not really involved in it, which is really, really lovely, because the way that they're including me means I get to do all the fun stuff and I don't have to do any of the things that are like actually a responsibility. But the way that it came about was really quite something. So I live in Los Angeles. I've worked on and off in Hollywood for, pretty much since I graduated college. So I have a whole management team, and I'm repped at a Hollywood agency, and I have all those connections. And with every book that I write, my team, we all get on the phone and we think like, okay, how could this be adapted? Do we think it's a TV show? Do we think it's a movie? Who do we think would like it? Who do we go to? And look, like anytime you have a project, Reese Witherspoon is the number one person you want to send it to, for 1,000 reasons, but she's also just done so much for books. And she has such an incredible, she's such great taste, but also that same focus on telling stories about women, complicated women. So someone on my team had heard that Reese Witherspoon liked Fleetwood Mac. And so we were like, okay, like, let's take our shot. And so they submitted it over there, and it also happened to be, it's a really random thing, but the woman that runs Reese Witherspoon's production company is married to a screenwriter who one of the screenwriters in a screenwriting duo who I have admired, for years. And so they were like, you know what, like, let's submit it to Reese Witherspoon's company and to this writer. And like, that's what we'll do. Never in a million years did I think both that writer and Reese Witherspoon were going to say yes and say that they wanted to work together. But that's what happened. And it was truly a dream come true. When I got the email that said that Reese Witherspoon wanted to talk to me, it was like 10 p.m. on a Saturday. And, I had a little kid and I was like ready to go to sleep. And I just like happened to look at my phone, and it was like I just like stared at it, and my husband was like, what's wrong? And I'm like, I was like, how could I put it into words that like Reese Witherspoon says that she read my book and loved it? Like, but it was just
an email directly from her.
It was like forwarded to me, it's like, I didn't directly talk to her, but she talked to my reps who then talked to me. And, everything just happened super quickly after that, because the thing is like, I want her to have it. It's like, you're not going to get you don't have to convince me, Reese Witherspoon. I will hand it to you. And so I got to speak with her, and I got to speak with the writing team, and the things that I loved about it, they loved about it. And it was just that dream where not only is this like the super cool, really exciting thing, but it's also the exact right creative team to hand something over to. And I've just been blown away by the scripts that they're writing, by the cast that they've put together. It's just, there's a small part of me that is a fan of Daisy Jones and the Six, the band, even though I made them up. And that part of me, it just cannot wait to see, this show.
Do you feel, having seen some of the script writing now, do you feel at all possessive about your work, or are you confident that you could just hand it over?
I'm pretty good about handing things over. I always have opinions. I always have like, it's like, oh, well, I tried that, but it didn't work in the book, so I don't know if it's going to work on the screen, But the thing is the scripts that I've read they're good. They're just really good. And there's so many different ways to tell a story that what matters to me is the spirit of it the same? Is its reason for existing in the world the same? And to me, the reason for this book to exist in the world is for women to see themselves in a story about rock, and for it to be all sorts of different women, and for there to be 1,000 different answers within this book about the way to navigate being a woman in a man's world. There's a way that Daisy does it, and there's a way that Karen does it, and a way that Camila does it, and a way that Simone does it, and they're all different. And that's what it stands for me. And the scripts that I've read stand for that. And that's what they're about, and that's what they care about. And so, you know, they'll change small things or make a, you know, character slightly different or whatever, but it's getting to the heart of it. And that's what you want. So I can't get too possessive over like, well, actually, they're not supposed to do that there. They're supposed to be over here. It's like, those are the small details. As long as the spirit of it stands for what I stand for, I'm happy.
Not wanting to interrogate you really deeply on this, but I am interested to know whether they're planning on making it like a music documentary in the kind of oral history way that it's been written.
Yeah, I mean, as far as I know now, they plan on having the talking heads. We'll have the people looking back on the period of time.
Wow.
But to be honest, they've done such a beautiful job of really fleshing out the world of the 70s that, you know, I mean, they haven't started shooting because of coronavirus. And so, you know, it will take whatever form it takes. You kind of, in Hollywood, you never know until the final cut. As of right now, the plan is that it is them looking back on this period of time and talking about it, and they've executed that beautifully.
We've only got a few minutes left, Taylor, and I really want to ask you about why you actually wrote the lyrics for the entire Aurora album.
Yeah. So I am not a songwriter. I have never done that before. But I felt like if I was reading this book, I would want them. I would want the lyrics. So much of the back and forth in the book that there's a massive chunk of it where everyone's just talking about the songs and what the songs mean and were they revealing things that were going on at the time or were they not. And if I was reading it, you know, you can have Daisy's perspective and you can have Billy's perspective. And of course, those are filtered through the narratives they're telling themselves, right? So I would be reading it going, okay, I understand what you're saying, I understand what you're saying, but let me see them and decide for myself what I think. And so, you know, that's one of those things where you just have to rise to the task at hand. I need an album of lyrics written, and I'm not a songwriter, so I better become a songwriter. It was an arduous process. It took me a really long time. They went through just as many drafts as the book went through, just over and over and over again. You pull one out, you put one back in, you move them around. And it was an interesting process because it was a little bit like a puzzle, because it's not just like writing a song, because if I was writing a song, I might write about myself or my life or the way I see the world and use phrases that I like. But that's not what I was doing. I was writing a song through the point of view of Daisy Jones or through the point of view of Billy, or a song that has to capture the tension between both of them writing together. And also I had to kind of take a point of view about certain songs and be like, well, Billy may say this is about this, and Daisy may say it's about this. What do I want to hint to the reader that it actually might be about? Who do I want to side with? Who do I, you know, where do I want to move the reader in as subtle of a way as possible toward what they may think? And so it was like dropping hints places and writing in character. But I will say it was probably my favorite part of writing the book. It ended up being such a joy and such a different muscle to flex. And now I'll like hear a song and I'll be like, oh, that's such a good lyric. Oh, I want to write another song, you know? So I just got to find a musician who needs a lyricist and like start doing that. But it was a real joy.
Taylor, it's been an absolute joy talking to you today, and I've thoroughly enjoyed delving into your work. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And thank you for your great questions. It was just such a lovely conversation to be having. So thank you for having me.
Oh, that's my pleasure. And I should also tell everyone who's listening that if you haven't been to Spotify and found the Daisy Jones and the Six playlist yet, that's another dimension as well.
There's a lot there for you. A lot of the music that I was listening to during that period of time is right there for you on the Spotify playlist.
so many answers are in the lyrics of Aurora and the lyrics and the song choices in the playlist. Yeah.
Exactly.
And just before everyone goes, I just want to let you know that our next conversation will be with iconic Australian actor John Wood, who has just written a memoir, and then in a couple of weeks' time after that with UK author David Mitchell about his new book, Utopia Avenue.
I want to be at that one. That's great.
You should totally join us for that one, Taylor. Seriously.
I want to hear what he says. I've heard it's a great book. I got to read it.
Yeah. There are some interesting parallels.
That's what I've heard. Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, look, I will happily have any parallels with David Mitchell. I bow.
Nice one.
David Mitchell.
Thank you so much again, Taylor Jenkins Reid, and to everyone who joined us today. And thank you so much to Jane Seaton from Beaufort Street Books for organising it. Have a great one, everybody.
Thank you. Bye.
See ya. Bye.